Hello and welcome to the special edition of India Foundation Chats. I'm Aditya Raj Kaul. Today, we will be discussing the measures that have been taken in the last 1 year in the Union Territory of Jammu and Kashmir and the Union Territory of Ladakh. Article 370 was abrogated on 5th of August 2019. It's been more than 15 months now. And now, different developmental measures are being taken, but still, terrorism continues, violence continues. Today, we will be discussing and in fact getting into depth of what the road ahead is for the common people all across the Union Territory of Jammu and Kashmir as well as Ladakh. And joining us today is senior leader of the BJP and in fact the member of the Board of Governors of the India Foundation, Mr. Ram Madhav. Thank you very much, Namaskar, Mr. Ram Madhav, for joining us.
Thank you.
I want to begin by asking you, it's been in fact a year since the measures that were taken, unthinkable measures in Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh, but what about the 15 months? There were a lot of promises made. Do you think this was the right decision? Do you think that the road taken by the government and the administration was positive and it did have the results that were really thought about?
The abrogation of Article 370 and Article 35A happened 15 months ago, as you rightly pointed out. It was a historic thing, but we also must keep in mind that the procedural formalities were completed towards the end of October last year. A gazette notification dividing the state into 2 union territories was finally promulgated towards the end of October last year. That means the state administration, the UT administration had actually 1 year in their hands in the last 1 year. If you look at the kind of changes that have taken place, post the abrogation of Article 370, also a little bit prior to that also. Firstly, on the political front, grassroots democracy has been given a new life in Jammu and Kashmir Union Territory. Let me focus on Jammu and Kashmir for some time. Panchayat Raj bodies, which just used to be ornamental in the past, never enjoying any powers because the Constitution's 73rd and 74th Amendment, which effectively gave powers to panchayats across the country, was not implemented in Jammu and Kashmir prior to the abrogation of Article 370. As a result, the panchayat system, although existed, it was just powerless. But after the abrogation of the Article 370, naturally, the 73rd and 74th Amendments of Indian Constitution got extended to that Union Territory also. That made the village panchayats, local bodies, very powerful like rest of the country. The state administration has successfully completed elections to local bodies. Today, there are elected bodies in all the panchayats across the Union Territory. Lot of money is being allocated to the panchayats directly. So the developmental activity at the grassroots has been kick-started in a big way. Firstly, by politically empowering the village panchayats, and secondly, following it up with economic empowerment of the elected bodies of the local village panchayats. I think that's a major shift that has happened. Jammu Kashmir, especially Kashmir Valley, has a very peculiar climate-related problem. From November to March, this very acute winter affects any developmental activity to happen in the region. So effectively, the state was left with time, starting with early March this year until now. Even in that, we had this COVID problem. In spite of all these difficulties, the state administration has been able to take the development to the doorstep of the ordinary people. Lot of infrastructure activity is happening in the state. The state's domicile law has been promulgated early this year. Now state has started recruitments in jobs. Some around 10,000 jobs vacancies are going to be filled up. So the job market is slowly picking up now. Had the corona pandemic not come in the way, state would have already had a major investor summit also. They had planned for it. Everything was in place. But suddenly this corona pandemic came, delaying the much needed boost up to economy in the state. In fact, Corona also affected state's economy, UT's economy in a different way, the annual Amarnath Pilgrimage Yatra. We were hoping that this year, after the abrogation of Article 370, it would attract more people. More people participating in the Yatra means more revenue to local Kashmiris. It would have actually improved the economic conditions of the people. But again, unfortunately, pandemic has not allowed that Yatra to take place. So amidst all these constraints also, the state administration is trying to do its best towards executing a lot of developmental projects. Overall, the trajectory is definitely upwards. One very important thing I mentioned, that is the role that the new LG is playing in UTs like Jammu and Kashmir. It's very important that the administration, because it is a UT, it is a president's rule situation now, the administration should be constantly engaged with the masses. Luckily, the new LG is constantly engaging with the people. He is traveling across the state, both in Jammu as well as in Kashmir, and he is going by road. He is not taking helicopter to reach places. So that way he is able to establish direct connect with the ordinary masses. That is giving a lot of confidence to the people.
But one thing that the government spoke about, the administration spoke about at that time, was ending discrimination, bringing in equality. Three set of people basically. One, the Valmiki Samaj, the Valmiki community. Second, the women folk of Jammu and Kashmir. And third, the West Park refugees. Promises were made. Some of them have been very happy with the developments that have been taking place. But do you think the promises that were made, the equality that was spoken about, has been restored out there in the last 15 months to these three set of people?
Technically speaking, with the annulment of Article 35A, which created a separate class of citizens in Jammu and Kashmir under the guise of state subject, with that ending for good, the discrimination has technically ended. Right. Now, all these sections that you talked about, the scheduled caste, the Valmiki Samaj, which migrated to Jammu and Kashmir in 50s, 60s, post the independence, the West Park refugees who came in right from 1948 onwards, and of course the women. These three sections which were facing a serious discrimination because of Article 35A, the state subject that status, they are now technically on par with any other citizen of the Jammu and Kashmir Union Territory. In addition to that, once the domicile law was promulgated, which categorically stated that those who are staying in the Union Territory region for more than 15 years will automatically become eligible for claiming domicile status, that for practical purposes puts an end to all the discrimination, especially with respect to the Valmiki Samaj and the West Park refugees. The domicile certificates are being issued to the citizens there. The local tahsildars have been authorized to issue those domicile certificates. As far as I know, already a couple of million people in the state have already secured their domicile certificates.
Coming to the political part, immediately after, or should I say before the abrogation of 370, some measures were taken for security, for political reasons. We saw three chief ministers, Farooq Abdullah, former chief ministers, Farooq Abdullah, Omar Abdullah and Mehbooba Mufti being detained initially at their own residences and then taken to separate areas that were formed as sub-jails. We saw several other former ministers also being detained from several local political parties there. Do you think this was really necessary? This was a measure that was taken perhaps considering the security measures, because the kind of criticism that happened nationally and internationally was immense.
Detention of political leaders happens based on security assessment. Now, abrogation of Article 370 and 35A was a very, very big historic kind of decision that Prime Minister Modi and Home Minister Amit Shah took about more than a year ago. At that time, the security assessment was that had the political leaders been allowed freedom to oppose or come out against those historic decisions, that would have probably led to serious situations, law and order situations. When security assessment is about securing law and order in the state, preventive detentions are a practice everywhere. I draw your attention to a statement by Mr. Omar Abdullah recently to one of the dailies, English dailies. He said that his party, even now, was not giving any call for agitation by the people because he anticipated that such agitations would lead to violence and then that would lead to unnecessary suffering of ordinary citizens. If Omar Abdullah feels that way today, you can imagine what would have been the thinking of the security establishment 1 year ago when that big decision was taken. It's only to ensure peace so that ordinary citizens of the state do not face any suffering, any problem. For that reason, preventive detention was taken as a measure, as a temporary measure. I must add here that having taken those measures, within 3 months' time, those political leaders, one by one, were set free. Within 3 months. Okay, senior leaders, they were detained for longer durations. They were also set free. Today, there is nobody under detention anymore. These were temporary measures. Although, on a lighter note, I tell you, I used to travel extensively in the UT region those days. Nobody, no ordinary person in Kashmir Valley was complaining about their arrests. If you keep aside very strong party cadres, ordinary people would actually come up and tell people like us that no, you have done a good thing, keep them for longer durations. We used to tell them that no, it's a temporary measure. They will have their political freedoms restored very soon, which we did. I think that the decision was taken based on certain security assessment in the interest of the peace and safety of the people.
Now, you saw what happened post the detention. Now that these chief ministers, former chief ministers, have been in fact released, we see National Conference, PDP and People's Conference for the first time coming together. And they have termed their entire agenda as People's Alliance for Gupkar Declaration. How do you see this? Because they say that they want restoration of 370, 35A and also statehood. Do you think this is a legitimate demand or do you think they are now taking the space of the separatists?
Gupkar Declaration is just, I think, a facade. As far as the demand for restoration of statehood is concerned, I think that in a democracy, if a union territory wants full statehood, it's a political demand.
Right.
There need not be any big objection to that demand from anybody. In fact, Union Home Minister himself has said that the statehood will be restored at an appropriate time. So I don't see any problem with the demand for statehood. But the way goalposts are being shifted by if I am permitted to use the word Gupkar group.
Right.
Earlier they used to talk about pre-1953. In fact, in 50s and 60s, even Sheikh Abdullah used to demand pre-1947.
Right.
But then, once Delhi Agreement happened, then subsequently their slogan used to be pre-1953. Now, the Gupkar group came out saying that pre-2019. So, goalposts are being shifted. Now, after doing that, suddenly Madam Mehbooba holds a press conference and says, the Gupkar Declaration go to hell, my demand is autonomy. So, Gupkar is not a real coherent group. They have their own ambitions, they have their own political agendas. As long as the demands are within the constitutional framework of India, like the demand for restoration of statehood, etc., we welcome that, no issues. They can agitate, they can demand for it. But they must remember that return of restoration of Article 370 and 35A are not going to happen for a very important reason that, of course, our party is committed to it, but the whole country has wholeheartedly welcomed the decision to abrogate those articles. More importantly, we don't see any big demand coming up from the people of even Kashmir Valley. Jammuites, of course, always wanted 370 to go. And people of Kashmir Valley also, in the last 1 year, have never come out making any such big demands. In fact, probably they have experienced life under Article 370 for 7 decades. Now they want to experience life without Article 370 for some time and see if it is more beneficial, they will be happy about it. Article 370 has only benefited the leaders of regional parties, not the ordinary people.
Another contentious issue has been, in fact, of the delimitation. Now, the BJP says that delimitation will happen and, in fact, will happen perhaps before the elections happen in the Union Territory of Jammu and Kashmir. Some quarters have been opposed to this entire idea, and there have been concerns raised earlier as well. Do you think if the delimitation does happen under the required time within the next 1 year, this will only help a certain few political parties? Or what exactly is the idea of those who are really opposed to this exercise that's been long pending?
Firstly, let me tell you, the entire country had delimitation done in 2008. But do you know when was the last delimitation happened in Jammu and Kashmir? 1995. Why did they not allow delimitation to take place in 2008? Because in 2006, the state legislature, using Article 370 as a tool, declared that we don't want delimitation in Jammu and Kashmir. You know, this is the kind of separatist attitude that 370 used to promote in the state. In fact, that's one of the reasons why we all felt that we should go. You know, they decided that they won't do delimitation until 2026. Thankfully, now that 370 has gone, that situation has gone, and the new Union Territory notification, it demands that we conduct the delimitation exercise first before we go for the polls. Because what happened in this new Union Territory notification was that the number of seats of the Union Territory legislature have been increased from 83 to 90, excluding 24 seats of POK. Now, once you increase the number of seats to 90, you have to conduct election to 90 assembly segments. That means you have to delimit the entire region to have 90 constituencies in place of 83. So, delimitation exercise is mandatory before the state can, the Union Territory can go for legislature elections. The Union Government, Union Home Ministry has appointed a commission headed by former Supreme Court Justice Ranjana Desai. And you are right. The regional, valley parties have refused to participate in the exercise. I only wish that good sense prevails and they review their decision, because delimitation is a necessary requirement for the state's legislature to be formed. And we want the state to have its own legislature as soon as possible, as soon as the delimitation exercise is completed, so that the affairs of the state can be returned to the people of the Union Territory.
Right. You touched upon elections, and so I want to ask you again about the statehood demand. Is BJP and the government committed that this is a reasonable demand and perhaps you would be considering that at an appropriate point in time? Because there have been quarters, specifically the PDP as well, saying that, we will not contest elections in the Union Territory if the statehood is not restored, and perhaps other demands as well. So will the BJP be in a position to either accept their demands or go alone in elections?
No, as far as the statehood question is concerned, as I mentioned earlier also, Union Home Ministry earlier stated that at an appropriate time, full statehood can be restored to Jammu and Kashmir. Now, those who are opposing elections without the UT getting statehood, I want to ask them one question. Why are their representatives sitting in the parliament then? Their MPs are sitting. Mr. Farooq Abdullah himself is a member of parliament. He is there. MPs will have, they won't leave their facilities in Delhi. They want to be there in the Indian parliament, but they don't want their legislators to get elected. They don't, they even boycotted local body elections. They don't want panchayats and sarpanchas to get elected. They don't want political powers to percolate downwards to grassroots people. Only they want to enjoy their political power sitting in Delhi and all that. I think this is political dishonesty. Making demand for full statehood, as I said, it's simply a political demand. The Union Territory always has a right to make a demand for that, and government will take its own view on that. But to use it as an excuse to boycott elections is definitely not called for. I only hope that whenever the elections are announced, those who are today talking about boycott will definitely reconsider their decision. I had some experience about the local body elections. They boycotted, thinking that their boycott would probably compel Prime Minister Modi to cancel or postpone the elections. They realized that they are dealing with a different kind of leadership in Delhi. So they had their proxies contesting the local body elections. They should know that whenever the elections are announced, the government is definitely not going to come under any kind of blackmail or pressure. So I hope they will take a wise decision about their participation or otherwise.
I want to touch upon the violence and the terrorism part again, because every political activity, economic activity, and others are related to the kind of security and safety in Jammu and Kashmir, particularly in Kashmir Valley. In the last 1 year, the security apparatus in Delhi and in Kashmir claims that there's been reduction in violence. The terror attacks have reduced, the encounters have picked up. There are close to 200 terrorists that have already been eliminated till October this year. Do you think this reduction of violence is here to stay, or would you compartmentalize this? That one is Pakistan-sponsored terror that is here to stay, perhaps because of the propaganda unleashed by Pakistan. One is radicalism locally due to various factors, and one is the overall violence. How do you see the reduction of violence playing out in the months and years ahead?
Ever since the state came under the President's rule in 2018, there was a concerted effort to tackle the problem of terrorism. It has yielded very good results. You also gave some numbers. That is the factual picture as of today. You know, it's never a happy thing to talk about any death. But the reality remains that the life of a terrorist in Kashmir Valley today is not even 6 months. If you turn to terrorism, you will face the consequences. That's the kind of very strict counter-terror, anti-terror measures that are being taken by security establishment in the Union Territory. Definitely, we in India Foundation have done a very detailed study of how the question of terrorism has been tackled by state security operators in the last 1 year. It clearly showed that the trends are downwards. The terrorism is definitely decreasing. And new recruitments are also not happening. Largely, people of the Union Territory are no longer, they don't have any great appetite for terror, violence and all that. They want peace. So less and less people are today attracted towards terrorism. And if you recall, you know that every counter-terror operation in the valley used to attract huge mass protests, leading to violence, leading to stone pelting, yeah. Then tear gas, then lathi charge, then bullets. Innocents, sometimes ordinary citizens also dying. So all these things have suddenly disappeared from the valley. I have seen worst phases of popular level violence after Burhan Wani's killing and all. We used to have reports of 200, 300 incidents on a single day. Today, in the last 1 year, no such violence at the people level. That means people are also not supporting terrorism anymore. Having said it, we still have terrorism incidents happening because you have a neighbor in Pakistan which is bent upon pushing more and more infiltrators across the border. That problem is also being tackled with an iron hand. I sincerely hope that with the measures that are in place now, this problem will further reduce and state will see a lasting peace and full freedom from terrorism in next few years.
You spoke about the broader picture of terrorism, but coming back to home in Kashmir, we've seen in the last 1 year targeted killings also happening. Several of the BJP activists and leaders on the ground have been killed. I remember several of them, I've reported on them in North Kashmir, in South Kashmir being attacked. We also saw a trend of people from the minority community who are participating in the political activity being killed. A Kashmiri Pandit was killed in Anantnag, who was participating in the Punch polls. A Sikh who was participant of the BDO elections in Kulgam was also targeted. How do you instill confidence in the political activists and workers from your party, from other parties on ground? Because these are the people who are going to, represent the people and convey a message of peace. If they are not safe, how will the political activity really carry forward?
Now, firstly, securing the lives of every ordinary Kashmiri citizen, including political activists of all the political parties, shall be the responsibility of the state administration and state's law and order machinery. The administration and machinery is committed to securing the lives of every citizen, every political activist in the state. Now, the targeted killings that you talked about show the cowardice of the terror establishment. They are under tremendous pressure from the security forces. Today, they don't dare attack security establishment. Do you know that in the last 1 year, the number of grenade attacks and other types of attacks on the security forces have come down from 50 previous year to 20 this year. They don't dare face the security forces in the valley. So what they are doing is targeting innocent political activists, innocent citizens. So this shows, on one hand, the utterly crude, crooked, violent side of terrorism, brutal side of terrorism, and also the utterly coward side of terrorism. As far as the killings of these political activists that you talked about, they are concerned, we are very sorry about the unfortunate deaths of some of course, people from our own party, but also people from other parties. For example, the Kashmiri Pandit you talked about probably was a member of Congress party. So these deaths are very unfortunate, but as far as our party is concerned, they could not or did not impact the morale of our cadres. They are still actively working for the people of the valley, for the state and for the country. There were few instances of these targeted killings, but the state administration and security establishment is taking enough precautionary measures.
In the last more than a year, we've seen separatist groups like the Hurriyat Conference, like the JKLF, almost disappear from the scene. We did see from initial 2018 itself, JKLF was banned. There was a ban on the Jamaat-e-Islami. Across South Kashmir, there were various steps taken. NIA, ever since 2017, has been very proactive. But do you see this as a permanent absence or only because of the stringent measures of the security forces? Because earlier we've seen stone pelting, we've seen radicalization, we've seen people like Gilani, Mirwais, Yasin Malik, Masrat Alam and others under focus. And over the last 15 months or more, they've already disappeared from the scene. So is this going to be a permanent scenario, or would we see perhaps a reappearance, because Kashmir has been very unpredictable?
The bodies like Hurriyat have today lost their credibility in the eyes of ordinary Kashmiris. And the measures that the government has taken, you see, in Kashmir, one of the factors for terrorism to thrive in all these decades, last 2-3 decades, was the overt and covert support that they enjoyed. Now that support has also been curbed by security establishments. The overgrown supporters, whether they are financiers or cheerleaders like Hurriyat, or the so-called intellectuals who would seek to provide intellectual justification to the inhuman terrorism in the valley, they all have been also taken care of by investigating agencies like NIA and others. The result is today, people are happy. There is nobody to shed any tears for one Masrat Alam or Asia Andrabi sitting in Tihar jail, because people want peace in the valley. So these bodies today don't enjoy any credibility. Now, whether they will come back, whether that climate will be resurrected, I don't think that will happen again in Kashmir Valley, for the important reason that today the administration is now really addressing the day-to-day issues of the people. Look at the Gupkar group. Have they talked about any single day-to-day issue of the Kashmiris? When there were winters, there was huge, severe problem of electricity. No talk about it by the Gupkar group. There are economic sufferings of the people because of COVID and also because of other reasons. They won't talk about it. They only talk about 35A and Article 370, only those emotive issues. But people are happy with administration attending to their day-to-day needs. If government succeeds, the administration succeeds in addressing the day-to-day issues of the people, I'm sure the bodies like Hurriyat will never have an opportunity to raise their head again.
I want to shift focus on the external front a little. Concerning Jammu and Kashmir, we've seen post-abrogation of Article 370, Pakistan expected a lot of hue and cry. But first few countries that welcomed it was Islamic republics or Muslim countries, including UAE and Maldives. We did see US, however, say that yes, it's an internal matter, we do not want to talk about it, but we can mediate. Trump said himself at least a couple of times, then taking a U-turn later, saying that yes, he's always available between Imran Khan and Prime Minister Modi to in fact mediate. And this was the line taken by the Obama administration as well, when John Kerry suggested numerous times that US could really play a role of a mediator. Where does India stand on this particular issue?
I think the bipartisan consensus on that issue has always been that thank you, but no thank you.
Right.
As far as issues of Indian constitution are concerned, like Article 370 abrogation, etc. are concerned, that will our internal matter. There is no role for any other country in those issues, including, of course, Pakistan. But even on issues that involve India and Pakistan, Shimla Agreement is the basis for our dealings. At that time, we decided that all those issues will be dealt on a purely bilateral basis. It's another matter that successive Pakistan governments violate that sacred principle all the time. They go to the United Nations, they go to their good friends on all sides, seeking their intervention, their support and all. But as far as India is concerned, we are capable of tackling our internal issues on our own and tackling our neighbor on a bilateral basis.
On Pakistan policy of New Delhi, do you think that we have a consistent policy but a paradigm shift after the Pulwama terror attack, where 40 of our CRPF bravehearts sacrificed their life for the country? We saw Balakot. However, earlier we saw a hot and cold approach. We did see Prime Minister Modi unexpectedly visiting Pakistan. We did see, in fact, measures for some kind of a dialogue to happen. We saw, in fact, Foreign Secretary Jaishankar at that particular time almost ready to visit Pakistan, but the Uri attack happened and Pathankot terror attack happened. Do you think that there's been a paradigm shift and there is a change in the way New Delhi is dealing with Pakistan militarily and diplomatically, and that is here to stay?
As a person who has been watching this particular issue very closely for many years now, much before I started handling political affairs of my party for Jammu and Kashmir, I can tell you from my understanding of the situation that how the way Prime Minister Modi is handling this question of Indo-Pak relations is markedly different from his predecessors. There's no doubt about it. One country that understood it fully well is Pakistan itself. They realized that for friends, he is a friend, but for enemies, he is a nightmare. So, Prime Minister Modi's handling of cross-border terrorism has conveyed to Pakistan one very important lesson. You know, in counter-terrorism understanding in the entire world. One thing is emphasized in counterterrorism, that terrorism must be made a costly affair to its perpetrators. That is one of the important steps to be taken as a counter-terrorism measure. Terrorism should be expensive, terrorism should be costly. Prime Minister Modi has made terrorism costly for its perpetrators. For Pakistan, you talked about Uri, you talked about Balakot. The consequences of it for Pakistan were very costly. In that sense, it's a big paradigm shift. That's the reason why, even in Kashmir Valley today, I'm not supposed to talk about these things in detail, but I can tell you, those who are getting killed mostly are the boys who just got into this vortex, unfortunate thing, the local boys. The Pakistani terrorists, the numbers are now dwindling, because Pakistan knows that there is a price to pay if we indulge in any such things. So in that sense, yes, there is an important shift in our handling of terrorism sponsored by Pakistan.
One last question on Jammu and Kashmir before we end this particular conversation is about the road ahead. Now, recently in an interview, the National Security Advisor of Pakistan, Moaz Yusuf, said that there was a message sent out by New Delhi for talks, and New Delhi expressing interest of having some kind of a talks or negotiations with Pakistan. Now, New Delhi has refused. The spokesperson of the Ministry of External Affairs said that nothing, it's not under his knowledge. Now, do you think this was a tactic yet again by the NSA of Pakistan to deflect attention from FATF, from internal, almost like a civil war situation, or the politicians who are, at their throats through PDM at this moment in Pakistan? And what exactly is the road ahead, if not dialogue, or New Delhi maintains that position that terror and talks cannot go together?
On such issues, people like me will only believe in what our government says. And I do hope that every Indian also takes it that way. What Government of India says is only to be believed when it comes to issues between our country and our neighbor, a neighbor like Pakistan. Now, why Pakistan is saying things like India is eager to talk and all, when India is saying that, no, we never said anything like that, is something that they only can explain. But I don't rule out the possibility of the Pakistani leadership trying to actually divert the attention of their own people from their own problems that they are facing now. Now, Imran Khan is facing worst ever political challenge from this combined opposition today. Huge. I mean, for the first time, the opposition seems to be defying even the army leadership. It appears. We don't know who is engineering what there. There's a problem with Pashtuns. There's a problem with Baloch. There is a growing serious problem in Sindh with the Sindhis. Then additionally, you see the FATF, the American sanctions, international sanctions and all that. Pakistan is in an utterly messy situation. To mislead its own people, maybe they are resorting to these kind of propaganda and all, I don't know. But in all these matters, I only take the word of our government as the final word. Whether to talk to them or not to talk to them, let the government of the day take a final decision based on the ground reality.
One last question before I let you go, because you talked about POK and other areas. Bilawal Bhutto very recently, not very long ago, said that पहले तो हम कहते थे कि श्रीनगर को कब हम वापस लेके आएंगे या फिर कब्जा करेंगे, अब हमें मुजफ्फराबाद बचाने को मुश्किल हो रहा है. And we've seen the kind of heat against Imran Khan and the deep state that is really being generated. Now, recently, again, Bilawal Bhutto and Maryam Nawaz said that Kashmir policy of Imran Khan has been a complete failure and we have almost surrendered. Now, do you think this desperation that has been seen with Imran Khan, the kind of statements he had made against the RSS, the Modi government and the BJP, is going to stay, or do you think he's facing diplomatic heat, being isolated globally, and perhaps there will be consequences for him personally and Pakistan in the months ahead?
We have seen successive governments in Pakistan handling Kashmir issue. We have seen it. It's not new. We have not seen any difference when Benazir Bhutto was the Prime Minister. You may recall the kind of very highly provocative statements he used to give in support of the terror in 1990s.
True.
Benazir Bhutto was no different. We have not seen any big difference when Nawaz Sharif was at the helm of affairs. Of course, under Musharraf, things were sent even further. So, while for political reasons they may issue any sort of statements, today Bilawal may say that Imran was a failure, but then what his mother did was also almost the same thing when it came to Kashmir. The reason is, one should understand that the Kashmir policy, as far as Pakistan is concerned, is controlled not by any political party, but by its army establishment. The army establishment has developed a huge vested interest in this particular problem simmering on. For various reasons, it helps Pakistani army control their political masters, probably have their own control over the entire political establishment in the country for whatever reason. So I don't give too much importance to the statement of the leaders. They are all political games that one plays to suit their political objectives. But beyond that, Kashmir policy has always been, as far as Pakistan is concerned, has always been in the hands of their Pakistani army leadership.
You know, I asked this question because you mentioned POK and he mentioned POK, and the Indian masses, after the surgical strike in Balakot, have their eyes on POK. So do you think that while there is a parliament resolution which says that Jammu and Kashmir and POK is an integral part of India, there would be efforts made, because there are, you know, sometimes statements given by the government of India, but no substantial action on how, when can POK actually become a part of India?
In 1994, when Narasimha Rao was the Prime Minister, the Indian Parliament had unanimously passed a resolution stating that only outstanding issue between India and Pakistan is to settle the status of POK, its return to India. So there has been a national consensus over this issue, Parliament consensus over this issue. We are all committed to the fact that it's under illegal occupation by Pakistan. One final thing I want to add here, that even in areas like Gilgit-Baltistan, a huge demographic change has been affected by successive governments in Pakistan. Now, the Kashmiri leadership, Mr. Farooq Abdullah, Mehbooba Mufti, they shout from rooftops about a non-existent demographic change happening in Kashmir. It's not happening actually. But they are mum about what's happening across the line of control in Gilgit-Baltistan. The Shia population has today been reduced to a minority. People from Khyber Pakhtunkhwa have been transported into Gilgit-Baltistan to completely change the demographic profile of the region. So these challenges do exist in our neighborhood, but our stand is very clear that all these areas are an integral part of India. That's why we have 24 seats. Even in the new UT legislature allocated for the Pak-occupied territories of Jammu and Kashmir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ram Madhav. In fact, you were watching special edition of India Foundation Chats with Mr. Ram Madhav, and we do hope for prosperity and peace, and in fact democracy, to be completely restored and future be as bright as the rest of the country in the Union Territory of Jammu and Kashmir. This is me, Aditya Raj Kaul, signing off.